Hey everybody, it's James Lindsay, and you are listening to the new Discourses podcast, and we're still exploring the American founding. I think I'm going to do kind of a lot of these, like I said before, and I think that people should join in. I don't necessarily mean that you make podcasts. Some of you that are podcasters listen. I think you might want to think about the idea, but I'm really strongly encouraged about this idea of like patriot reading groups or whatever you want to call them. Patriot Book Night, where you take these books or these texts from our founders or books about the revolution or biographies of the founding fathers or whatever, and we actually start to inform ourselves and each other by doing these kind of, reading groups regularly to bring this material back to our awareness. And the thing I want to read today is from John Adams, written in 1765. It was an incredibly important document in the lead up to the revolution and what we might consider the pre-revolutionary period. It set a lot of the mood that went on to, it didn't just capture the mood, but it set a lot of the mood that went on to become the revolutionary spirit, the cause of liberty. And it's a really important piece of American history that frankly is new to me and is going to be new to a lot of people. So I want to share it. So the context behind what's going on, how I came across this, is that I started to read, thinking that it would be appropriate for a lot of reasons, a couple of books about the American Revolution. The first one, and the one that I've spent more time with so far, is called Revolution by my friend Eric Metaxas, who is actually he's telling this story, as far as I can tell, having read about a quarter of it so far, very honestly. It's excellently written. I do recommend it. Revolution by Eric Metaxas. It is taking, ultimately, given Eric, he is, taken by and emphasizing the Christian and Judeo-Christian aspects of the American founding through this document, which I've spoken with him at length about this, and he says, it's inescapable. I have another book called Proclaiming Liberty that I've spent a little less time with so far by Tim Sandefur, who's got kind of a different angle, different presuppositions, and he's telling largely the same story so far as I can tell so far, and that is getting about to the point of the Townsend Acts, which are not what I'm going to talk about today, but this is part of our history. This is part of the Revolution and Founding. I think those are worthy reads. So they're also not just worthy reads in and of themselves that I would recommend for such like a book club endeavor, revolutionary book club or whatever. They are also sources. If you are a researcher, we're all supposed to do our own research these days. If you are a researcher, one of the things that you learn to do when you read a source is to track its sources, is to look up and say, well, who did Eric Metaxas get these ideas from? Or he referenced this document in the historical literature. Rather than just reading his quotes, what does the document itself actually say? So I've been reading these books with an eye to that, particularly to, as I would, the original source documents. I'm not quite as interested in reading other books about the revolution right now. I've got more than enough on my plate. But when I hear that John Adams wrote something that was absolutely pivotal in 1765, and the quotes are interesting and inspiring, and it has the title Dissertation on the Canon and Feudal Law, which I don't know anything about, I think to myself, I wonder if I can find that online. Turns out, yes, I can. It's very easy. Most of these things are available online for free if you look them up and do just a little legwork sometimes, or almost none most of the time. And then you can read them. As you know, if you're listening regularly to the New Discourses podcast, I recently read a sermon given by Jonathan Mayhew, or most of the sermon, in 1750, which is actually a precursor to this 1765 essay, or series of 4 essays really, by John Adams. And these are the pre-revolutionary ideas. These are the ideas that were inspiring Americans to become Americans. And that sermon by Mayhew, if you didn't listen to it and so you don't know, is his take on Romans 13. It is, in my opinion, the most American and probably best exegesis of Romans 13 available. It's been available as a central piece of American history that most people aren't aware of since 1750. So now that we're still having those same debates today, we can look back to the fact that our country was founded on resolving that debate. And I encourage people to do that. I'm finding it edifying to stop as I go through these two books about the revolution. Again, Revolution by Eric Metaxas and Proclaiming Liberty by Tim Sandefur. I'm finding it edifying to stop and go read these primary sources for myself, and then to come back to the text with a much richer understanding. This is the kind of behavior I would like to encourage other Americans to do, and to drag their teenagers along with them and through it. Maybe also your young 20-somethings. Get them off the TikTok. Get them to read 20 pages of John Adams and do it as a family or a group activity. Think of like a Bible study, but for American patriotism, with this idea that is going to be very prominent in this particular essay, that if we want to survive as a people, if we want to continue the American experiment, we have to know who we are. There's kind of this vision that a lot of the founders had of the American Israel, that we were the people escaping from the bondage, not of Pharaoh in Egypt, but of frankly, canon and feudal law in Europe, but that we're kind of a parallel story, looking back with our kind of moment of inspiration to liberation being not God speaking to Moses, but rather the Reformation, which allowed man to read in his own native tongue the Bible as it's actually written, and to communicate it, and to study not just the Bible as it's written, say, in the King James English, but also to learn the Hebrew and the Greek and the Latin, and to study the Bible as it was written in those languages, some of which are the originals, and thus to improve your understanding of it. It's also a call to the importance of education. We have to be an educated people, not just knowing who we are, not just that kind of, frankly, Jewish sense of memory. The Jewish people have survived in some sense as long as they have, as successfully as they have, partly because they are a people of memory. They remember where they came from, what they believed, what they had faith in. This is the theme of Hebrews 11, the famous dissertation on faith. That they know who they are and how they were defined by their faith, and they celebrate that history. Well, here in America, we should be thinking of ourselves the same way. If the founders thought of ourselves as a new Israel, if they were it's the American Israel, if they were thinking of the Great Seal of the United States, perhaps depicting Moses either crossing the Red Sea or following the cloud through the desert, being God, and this was a motif that they were thinking of themselves, maybe also thinking of ourselves as a people who have to have a memory of who we were is very important. So John Adams brings that up. So it's very pertinent to this idea of creating these study clubs. This is, in fact, what John Adams is going to recommend in this pre-revolutionary period, primarily, is that people take their studies more seriously, that they study for them the British Constitution to know who they are and what their rights are, to study the history of British common law, British freedom and liberalism, but also to study the experiences and the trials and tribulations, and to recognize the prices paid by their American forebears. Why did they come to America? Why did they flee the canon and feudal law, the church-state fusion of tyranny in Europe? Why did they risk everything, upend their lives, and come live on an inhospitable continent in rough conditions to stake out something different in the name of being free? And he says we have to remember and know that. He encourages people to be well-versed in natural philosophy and therefore to understand the sciences, in law, and all these other things, to know our rights, to know what's going on, to become informed. And he says that this is one of the most important things that defines America as unique and special and ultimately deserving of the liberty that it's laying claim to. And he also gives us as the recommendation for how to prepare for the revolutionary period that he doesn't fully understand is coming here 11 years before 1776, before he would sign the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so I digress. That's why I'm doing this. This is roughly what this essay is about. But again, I just strongly encourage diving into these original primary sources. The language is hard. The language is difficult. Take the time to make sure you understand it sentence by sentence if you have to. Do this in groups. read, come together, ask each other questions, prepare materials, maybe even set up, somebody's going to lead and do a little speech or do a book report or whatever else. A lot of these things are not super long. Some of them are, but as you could hear if you listen to the Mayhew podcast, I read the entire sermon minus a little bit in about 2 hours. So you can read it not out loud and without commentary in about an hour and a half or so if you're kind of clipping along, even with the stuffy, old-fashioned language. Okay, so again, I'm repeating myself. I really think this is a good idea. I think we need to be doing this, thinking of ourselves in these terms and equipping ourselves to understand who we are, what the Constitution says, what people believed in before us through the entirety of American history, how we paid in blood and treasure and all kinds of other costs to obtain and secure what we have, to find not just gratitude, but understanding and appreciation. And I could just wax on this forever. I'm going to actually do something I don't normally do with a text. I'm going to read this little introduction that is given by, who is offering this introduction? This is the dissertation on the canon and feudal law by John Adams, written under a pseudonym, as it turns out, Humphrey Plowjogger, in 1765 with relation to the Stamp Act, and it is annotated, and I'm assuming that the introduction is given by Fred Bischoff, and trying to figure out, he's got a website, fredbischoff.com. I don't know anything about that, but I don't know who this guy is, so I don't know if this was like a university or whatever. It's on his website. I found the document. But anyways, I digress. His introduction kind of sets the stage. This way I don't have to do too much, but I'm going to give you kind of the Revolution in a Teapot version from what I've picked up in these books about the Revolution, and then I'm going to read his introduction. And so the Revolution in a Teapot boils down to that the French and Indian War took place. This was a largely territorial war. The British colonists here in the American continent were very coastal. As you start to get in toward the Ohio River, the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, the French were laying claim to some of that land. Obviously, it was heavily populated by the so-called Indian tribes. And the British decided that they wanted to make sure that the French couldn't have that land, and so they helped launch the French and Indian War. Mostly the fighting was done by American colonists, but certain among the British, including great captains like William Pitt, came over, and they ended up winning, but it ended up being very expensive. So the story in a teapot is the British wanted to fight the French and Indian War. They won. It was expensive. They decided it primarily benefited the Americans, so the Americans were going to have to pay their alleged fair share of the cost of the war to replenish their the treasury, which was depleted. The national debt was high after this war in Britain, and they were going to force the Americans to pay their fair share through a series of different policies, acts, laws, etc. Most famously, probably the Stamp Act, and then later the tax on tea that led to the Boston Tea Party. That was in 1773. So 8 years after the Stamp Act, which was in 1765. The first of these was actually an anti-smuggling policy. This was some years earlier, the very end of the 1750s going into the early 1760s. I think it was passed in 60 or 61. And this act was basically to start cracking down on all of the smuggling, which meant trade that wasn't being done with the British and therefore wasn't subject to duties and taxes under the British. And this was taken to be a gigantic violation of Americans' private property rights, as the act enabled British officers to come in and basically just search and seize property on the mere suspicion of smuggling. When you start to read these things that happened leading up to the Revolution, you might read the Bill of Rights, or read it in high school or in middle school or as an adult, and thought, wow, how did they think of all this stuff? And it turns out it's just a bunch of crap the British did to them. And they were like, no, hell no, you're not doing this again. And so the things in the Bill of Rights can be read as stuff that the British tyrannized the American colonists with, and that the American colonists rejected. So the Stamp Act comes along. I'm not going to get into that particular part, but the Stamp Act comes along. I'm not going to talk about the Stamp Act in too much. That was a revolution in the nutshell, by the way. We're already done with it. They wanted the money, so they put all these acts. I didn't finish the whole story, I guess. The Americans said no. This turned into a huge fight back and forth across the Atlantic that culminated with the American colonists demanding their rights as British citizens under British Constitution, and which is primarily the idea of consent of the governed, which they felt like they didn't have. This is your famous taxation without representation line. And the British said, no, you basically aren't British citizens, you're subjects. And so they were like, okay, we're not. We declare independence. And then the rest is history. The British didn't like it. They launched a war. They lost the war. And America became a country, figured out a constitution at some point, and we're off to the races. So that's the revolution in a teapot. But this introduction says early in the Stamp Act. What was the Stamp Act? The Stamp Act was really one of the first of these actual taxes that the British wanted to charge to try to raise revenues. And what it was that every piece of paper that was in any way considered a legal document, this would even include newspapers and magazines and pamphlets and so on, in order to be able to be like used in the colonies, every official piece of paper, every letter, every, correspondence, every legal document would have to bear a stamp, and that stamp would cost a small tax. You would have to pay, in other words, to use paper. And the American colonists were like, no. First of all, no. And second of all, why? Are you trying to smash our freedom of speech? They were very suspicious of that. Do you not want us to be able to communicate? Do you want to make the person who's in charge of the stamp have to be able to approve what's getting the stamp? You're going to put a control on speech. This is very relevant kind of stuff for today with our social media battles, actually. These fights kind of never go away. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance, they said, and it turns out to be kind of the case. But anyway, the American colonists were having absolutely none of this. They suspected the British were up to no good, which might have actually been true. They saw this as completely unwieldy and most importantly, to the specific narrow point, it was them being taxed in a very unreasonable way that offered the possibility of a kind of restriction of speech liberties that they found intolerable, but that they were being taxed without their consent. And the crucial aspect to that is that the colonists did not have any representation in Parliament, and the Parliament was foisting this tax on them in violation of the British Constitution, which is based off of the Magna Carta, which demand that if you are going to tax people or otherwise take their property straight out of their pockets or hands, you have to get their consent or go through the due process of law. The British's perspective on this was, we're Parliament, everything works at our pleasure, the colonies work at our pleasure, and therefore they have to shut up and take it. And this was a big drama. As a matter of fact, this is in effect the crack that became the split between the two countries. So early in 1765, the introduction reads, John Adams began writing an essay on the history of ecclesial and civil despotism for the Solidity, a private club of Boston lawyers. His purpose was to contrast the tyranny of the canon and feudal law, that's the church, and the system with kings, the what am I looking for? The temporal authorities vested in kings and dukes and duchesses and all of this stuff. So the canon and feudal law against New England's heroic struggle for freedom. He soon decided to expand and publish his dissertation on the canon and feudal law when he learned of Parliament's approval of the Stamp Act in March 1765. In his diary, Adams described the Stamp Act as an, quote, enormous engine fabricated by the British Parliament for the battering down of all the rights and liberties of America. So this was in pretty broad terms. And just to kind of point out, again, this was such a daring thing to write at the time that John Adams did not write it in his own name, but rather in the name of Humphrey Plowjogger. Very obvious fake name. It was published in 4 parts in 4 editions of the Boston Gazette, about a month apart for each one. spanning the months in lead up to the activation. After the passage of the Stamp Act, it would come into effect at the either the 31st of October or the 1st of November. I forget how that works, which side of that it was. But he was putting this out in advance of it taking effect to try to basically say that it was completely wrong and that the American colonists had no reason whatsoever to respect it. So the introduction goes on. The dissertation, again, on the canon and feudal law, is an essay in political education. Its larger purpose was to raise an alarm against an impending threat and arouse the people in defense of their rights. Adams saw the Stamp Act as an early warning signal indicating the direction of the British colonial policy, and I'll add, not wrongly. It violated in two important ways the most fundamental principle of the English Constitution, the principle of consent. The Stamp Act denied the rights guaranteed by the Magna Carta that no citizen shall be deprived of his property or taxed without his consent, and it extended juryless courts of admiralty into the American colonies. When combined with the recently passed Sugar Act, the Stamp Act wasn't the first one, it was the second one, the Sugar Act was the first one. The Stamp Act permitted the transfer of revenue enforcement from regular common law courts to the newly empowered admiralty courts. In Adams' eyes, this meant that unconstitutional courts would now enforce unconstitutional taxes. He concludes rather ominously by suggesting that there was a, quote, direct and formal design on foot to enslave all America, end quote. And again, that is debatable at the time, whether many in Parliament, some in Parliament likely had that intention. Whether many did or not, it's an open question. Whether George III on the throne did or not is another question, but those questions are not for us to answer. We will now turn to John Adams in a very inspired piece of text, a dissertation on the canon and feudal law. And again, that means church and feudal state, or so you have the monarchy and the episcopate. So this would be the monarchy, and the canon would be the episcopate. So a dissertation on the canon and feudal law. The first of these was published on Monday, the 12th of August, 1765. To the printers, he wrote, like it's a letter. Ignorance and inconsideration are the two great causes of the ruin of mankind. That's a quote. This is an observation of Dr. Tillotson with relation to the interest of his fellow men in a future and immortal state. But it is of equal truth and importance if applied to the happiness of men in society on this side of the grave. In the earliest ages of the world, absolute monarchy seems to have been the universal form of government. Kings and a few of their great counselors and captains exercised a cruel tyranny over the people, who held a rank in the scale of intelligence in those days, but little higher than the camels and elephants that carried them and their engines to war. So that's a pretty dramatic opening, right? Besides the quote, here he is setting up that absolute monarchy is not good, but it was basically everywhere. It is a form of cruel tyranny over the people, and that the people were kept so stupid such that they would basically just do the work and go to war for the kings. Not a big fan of the feudal system. By what causes it was brought to pass, Adams writes, that the people in the Middle Ages became more intelligent in general would not perhaps be possible in these days to discover. But the fact is certain, and wherever a general knowledge and sensibility have prevailed among the people, arbitrary government and every kind of oppression have lessened and disappeared in proportion. So here he's saying that for some reason or another, people started to get smarter and woke up, became more literate, more informed through the especially latter part of the Middle Ages. He doesn't know how, but as they did, the tyranny over them fell apart. And that's why I said that he's so focused on people being educated and informed and deep thinkers, and that is one of the traits of America that's going to make it all work, which is why we should be having book clubs to remedy the crisis of that state in our own country. Okay, so arbitrary government and every kind of oppression have lessened and disappeared in proportion as general knowledge and sensibility have prevailed among the people. He says, man has certainly an exalted soul and the same principle in human nature, that aspiring, noble principle founded in benevolence and cherished by knowledge, I mean the love of power, which has been so often the cause of slavery, has, whenever freedom has existed, been the cause of freedom. If it is this principle that has always prompted the princes and nobles of the earth by every species of fraud and violence to shake off all the limitations of power, it is the same that has always stimulated the common people to aspire at independency and to endeavor at confining the power of the great within the limits of equity and reason. So that's a very peculiar paragraph. It takes some thinking about, but what he's saying there is that humans desire power. They love power. And that has caused lots of tyrants to basically create slaves of their people. But when regular people start to get informed about how the world works, they want the power for themselves, not necessarily to rule other people, but to have independence and to take the ruling class and to put them under controls, the limits of equity and reason. And now this isn't equity in the way that the modern left wing uses it, where we're having redistribution of goods, services, power, and opportunity so that everybody comes out equal and really so their grifters come out ahead. This is equity in the sense that people get their just deserts. Equity is for the amount that you put in. That's how much, in some sense, you should be able to expect to get out, right? People get their fair share out of what they actually contribute. And then reason is a pillar that these guys are appealing to. In Jonathan Mayhew's fiery sermon that we read on a previous episode that inspires John Adams to write this, he talks again and again and again about the need for common sense to weigh in on exegesis of Scripture. Okay, so that's using your own reason, your own common understanding, your own everybody can make sense of things for themselves if they apply their brains and also set aside their passions and their desires with the aim to best understand. So we're going to endeavor to confine the power of the great when we become informed. I'm not going to do tons and tons of commentary. I want to let him speak, but it's some of this is too sweet to ignore. The poor people, it is true, Adams writes, have been much less successful than the great. They have seldom found either leisure or opportunity to form a union and exert their strength. Ignorant as they were of arts and letters, they have seldom been able to frame and support a regular opposition. This, however, has been known by the great to be the temper of mankind, and they have accordingly labored in all ages to wrest from the populace, as they are contemptuously called, the knowledge of their rights and wrongs, and the power to assert the former or redress the latter. I say rights, for such they have undoubtedly antecedent to all earthly government. Rights that cannot be repealed or restrained by human laws, rights derived from the great legislator of the universe. Legislator there is capitalized, by the way, just to be clear, we know he's talking about God. Okay, so what he's saying here is the great try to keep the people subjected by making sure they don't have the capacity to understand the knowledge of their own rights and wrongs. Right? And in particular, the powers don't want them to know their rights, but they need to be reminded rights for such they have undoubtedly antecedent to all earthly government. Their rights precede the governments. This is a very radical proposition that's coming to define the American mentality. It is an extension of the British mentality going back to the Magna Carta, but it's going to take on an entirely new character and strength through the struggles of the colonists. Okay, so rights that cannot be repealed or restrained by human laws, rights derived from the great legislator of the universe. Since the promulgation of Christianity, he tells us, the two greatest systems of tyranny that have sprung from this original are the canon and the feudal law. So he starts off there, he says all this stuff about how we have all these rights from God, and he says since Christianity got put around the world, what do we get? two systems of tyranny. In fact, he'll say two that interact: the canon law, that is the church's law, and the feudal law, which is the law of the kings. The desire of dominion, that great principle by which we have attempted to account for so much good and so much evil, is, when properly restrained, a very useful and noble movement in the human mind. Properly restrained is in italics. So the desire for dominion, he says, is actually good and bad, and when it is properly restrained, it is a very useful and noble movement in the human mind. But when such restraints are taken off, it becomes an encroaching, grasping, restless, and ungovernable power. Numberless have been the systems of iniquity contrived by the great for the gratification of this passion in themselves, but in none of them were they ever more successful than in the invention and establishment of the canon and the feudal law. So I will just go ahead and say that it's hard to imagine John Adams not liking these things more. The canon law and the feudal law. If you are listening to this and thinking maybe the idea of having a new monarchy would be opposed to the American founders, you couldn't be more right, at least with regard to John Adams. And if you are thinking Christian nationalism is probably not something that this founder liked, even though they use John Adams to justify Christian nationalism all the time by saying, quote, "Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people and is wholly inadequate to any other," you would also be right. John Adams is not a fan of Christian nationalism, so it's extraordinarily disingenuous when they invoke a quote of his outside of that context and view in order to bolster that. And he's not a fan of monarchy very strongly. He says, in fact, that numberless have been the systems of iniquity contrived by the great for the gratification of the passion for domination in themselves, but none of them were ever more successful than in the invention and establishment of the canon and feudal law. There have never been worse tyrannies than these two things, especially when they work together, he will point out. By the former of these, that's the canon law, he says, by the former of these, the most refined, sublime, extensive, and astonishing constitution of policy that ever was conceived by the mind of man was framed by the Romish clergy for the aggrandizement of their own order. So the most refined, sublime, extensive, and astonishing constitution of policy of canon law comes down to the Roman Catholic Church program. P.S. John Adams, not a big fan, just like his congregationalist forebear, Jonathan Mayhew, not big fans of Catholics, okay? Which makes it sort of funny how deeply the woke right movement is an attempt to, make America Catholic. Not again, because it never freaking was. But anyway, John Adams has some choice words about Catholics, and me relating them and agreeing with the thrust of his argument is not James hating Catholics, by the way. And it's also, he might have hated Catholics. I don't know. I don't hate Catholics. I think that these guys understood the fears, or had understood and had reasonable fears of the idea of an ecclesial authority like the Catholic Church established across Europe. So that's part of knowing your history. They were terrified of this. They were centrally motivated to be on the American continent because of that. But they were also wise enough to allow the religious liberty such that not only were there Catholics in the founding era of the United States here in America on the North American continent, but at least one of them signed the Declaration of Independence. They were not excluded. So while the Catholics of today maybe exercise a lot of folly in trying to overturn the American system for their, Romish program, the founders, whom they are invoking and simultaneously challenging and suggesting got things wrong, had the wisdom to include them under the same umbrella of religious liberty that they were claiming for themselves. This was not going to be a Protestant nation. It was going to be based on the Protestant ethic, which is that the conscience will not be delimited by the canon or the feudal law, which they clearly opposed. So this is spicy. All the epithets I have here given to the Romish policy are just, and will be allowed to be so when it is considered that they even persuaded mankind to believe faithfully and undoubtingly that God Almighty had entrusted them with the keys of heaven, whose gates they might open and close at pleasure, with a power of dispensation over all the rules and obligations of morality, with authority to license all sorts of sins and crimes, with a power of deposing princes and absolving subjects from allegiance, with a power of procuring or withholding the rain of heaven and the beams of the sun, with the management of earthquakes, pestilence, and famine, nay, with the mysterious, awful, incomprehensible power of creating bread and wine, out of bread and wine, the flesh and blood of God himself. That was a pretty heavy-duty condemnation of Catholic doctrine, and John Adams doesn't like it. They're opposed to this, but they're willing to allow religious liberty for people who want to believe it, so long as they don't do what the post-liberals are doing today and try to overthrow the system. All these opinions they were enabled to spread and rivet among the people by reducing their minds to a state of sordid ignorance and staring timidity, by infusing into them a religious horror of letters and knowledge. So here he's accusing the Catholic Church of tyrannizing people by keeping them stupid and fearful, and in particular infusing in them a religious horror of education, of knowing things about the world or the Bible itself. Thus was human nature chained fast for ages in a cruel, shameful, and deplorable servitude to him and his subordinate tyrants, who, it was foretold, would exalt himself above all that was called God and that was worshipped. And he's talking about the Pope there, guys. In the latter, so now we've switched to feudal law, so we've left, that's his commentary about the worst excesses of canon law, the Catholic Church, which, by the way, these guys thought was basically a mirror image repeated in the Anglican Church that they were not fans of. This isn't that kind of fight. But now he's switching gears to criticize the idea of monarchy. Again, now removed from the church part. In the latter, the feudal law, in the latter we find another system, similar in many respects to the former, the canon law, which, although it was originally formed perhaps for the necessary defense of a barbarous people against the inroads and invasions of her neighboring nations, yet for the same purposes of tyranny, cruelty, and lust, which had dictated the canon law, it was soon adopted by almost all the princes of Europe and wrought into the constitutions of their government. So, in order to protect against barbarians, they had these feudal law systems, and the same tyrannies, cruelties, and lusts perverted them, as happened within the great church, such that this model monarchy was adopted by all the princes of Europe. Now, don't forget, John Adams at this point is a monarchist. He is a subject of the king. It would be treason for him to say otherwise. And this document that I'm reading to you is considered one of the finest examples of dancing on the line of treason without crossing it ever written. And he's not necessarily opposed to a king that stays within his bounds, but rather a tyrant. And the suggestion is eventually going to be that that is what happens when you have somebody who has absolute power, even under a constitutional monarchy. So this is a rejection even of constitutional monarchies. But he had to be careful. It's 1765. Writing this in 1765 as a British subject is an astonishing thing. The risk he's taking is insane. Anyway, back to the feudal law. It was originally a code of laws for a vast army in a perpetual encampment. The general was invested with the sovereign property of all the lands within his territory, of him as his servants and vassals. The first rank of his great officers held the lands, and in the same manner the other subordinate officers held them, and all ranks and degrees held their lands by a variety of duties and services, all tending to bind the chains the faster on every order of mankind. So there was this hierarchical thing, like the Nazis called the Führerprinzip, where the general, well, the king eventually, but the generals hold control of all the land, and it's kind of like an army thing, and then the people below him hold lands within that, and then below him hold lands within that, and so on and so forth, down to like counties, which are run by a count, and they all have all these duties and services that serve to do what, in John Adams' view? all tending to bind the chains faster on every order of mankind. He is not a fan of the feudal legal system, which, by the way, fascism reproduces, communism reproduces in a distorted form, and etc. In this manner, the common people were held together in herds and clans in a state of servile dependence on their lords, bound even by the tenure of their lands to follow them whenever they commanded to their wars, in a state of total ignorance and of everything divine and human, excepting the use of arms and the culture of their lands. So you're just their soldier and their farmer, and you are completely their slave. So he's not a big fan. But another event still more calamitous to human liberty was a wicked confederacy between the two systems of tyranny above described. That would be a state church, or as the integralists call it, integralism. It seems to have been even stipulated between them that the temporal grandees, that's your civil authorities, the temporal grandees should contribute everything in their power to maintain the ascendancy of the priesthood, and that the spiritual grandees in their turn should employ their ascendancy over the consciences of the people in impressing on their minds a blind implicit obedience to civil magistracy. So there is a 1765 criticism of integralism, which doesn't come into existence until the late 19th century, almost 120 years later by Pope Leo XIII, given by John Adams, laying down the fundamental bedrock of what it means to be American, which means not integralist. He calls this still another event more calamitous to human liberty was the wicked confederacy between the two systems of tyranny above described. Okay, so not a fan of integralism was John Adams. Although integralism was still 120 years in the future, Americans were not going to truck with that. That's why they left Europe to begin with. Thus, he goes on, as long as this confederacy lasted, the church-state fusion, and the people were held in ignorance, not a fan, by the way, of Christian nationalism, as long as this confederacy lasted and the people were held in ignorance, liberty and with her knowledge and virtue too seemed to have deserted the earth. And one age of darkness succeeded another till God in his benign providence raised up the champions who began and conducted the Reformation. So there's a very strong argument to be made from this paragraph that America is the fruit of the Reformation, and that the Americans saw themselves consciously as a new Israel that is the fruit of the Reformation. Okay, so this is Reformation country, guys. This is MAGA Reformation country. Okay, but that's a pretty solid condemnation of the church-state program, is that as long as it lasted, liberty and with her knowledge and virtue seemed to have deserted the earth, and one age of darkness succeeded another, until what? Until God stepped in his benign providence and raised the champions who began and conducted the Reformation. From the time of the Reformation to the settlement of America. So thus you can see that he sees there's a straight line from Reformation to America, right? From the time of the Reformation to the first settlement of America, knowledge gradually spread in Europe, but especially in England. And in proportion as that increased and spread among the people, ecclesiastical and civil tyranny, which I use as synonymous expressions for the canon and feudal laws, seem to have lost their strength and weight. So the Reformation happens, knowledge and learning start to spread across Europe, especially in England, and as that happened, tyranny, ecclesiastical and civil tyranny, the canon and feudal laws seem to have lost their strength and weight. Something was happening in the world, something big. The people, he says, grew more and more sensible of the wrong that was done them by these systems, more and more impatient under it, and determined at all hazards to rid themselves of it, till at last, under the execrable race of the Stuarts, the struggle between the people and the confederacy aforesaid of temporal and spiritual tyranny became formidable, violent, and bloody. It was this great struggle that peopled America. It was not religion alone, as is commonly supposed, but it was a love of universal liberty and a hatred, a dread, a horror of the infernal confederacy before described that projected, conducted, and accomplished the settlement of America. So according to John Adams, writing in 1765, what was it, this is America's second president to be, what was it that caused America to fill up with people? Why did people move there and settle there and establish the colonies that became the United States some years later? It was not religion alone that drove them. It was liberty. It was a love of universal liberty, liberty for everybody, and also on its other side of that love, a hatred for the tyranny of a church-state fusion, of the monarchical episcopate. So a hatred, a dread, a horror of the infernal confederacy before described that projected, conducted, and accomplished the settlement of America. Couldn't put a finer point on it than that. It was a resolution, he writes, formed by a sensible people, and I mean the Puritans, almost in despair. The settlement of America was a resolution formed by sensible people, meaning the Puritans, almost in despair. They had become intelligent in general, and many of them learned. For this fact, I have the testimony of Archbishop King himself, who observed of that people that they were the most intelligent and better read than even the members of the church, whom he censures warmly for that reason. This people had been so vexed and tortured by the powers of those days for no other crime than their knowledge and their freedom of inquiry and examination, and they had so much reason to despair of deliverance from those miseries on that side of the ocean that they at last resolved to fly to the wilderness for refuge from the temporal and spiritual principalities and powers and plagues and scourges of their native country. Wilderness is in italics. They fled to the wilderness for refuge from the temporal and spiritual, that's state and church, principalities and powers. We know that these invoking Jesus's remark there that we fight not against flesh and blood, but principalities and powers, and plagues and scourges of their native country. Again, that cognizance of being like Israel escaping from Egypt. After their arrival here, they began the settlement and formed their plan, both of ecclesiastical and civil government, in direct opposition to the canon and feudal systems. So they come across the ocean, they risk everything, they're in the wilderness, and they set up their systems of church and state governance directly opposed to the whole idea of the canon and the feudal systems, plus obviously their horrific fusion. That is America, boys. That's it right there. The Christian nationalism? No, not so much. No, not so much. Don't listen to these damn liars. Not so much. The leading men among them, both of the clergy and the laity, were men of sense and learning. To many of them, the historians, orators, poets, and philosophers of Greece and Rome were familiar, and some of them have left libraries that are still in being, consisting chiefly of volumes in which the wisdom of the most enlightened ages and nations is deposited, written, however, in languages which their great-grandsons, though educated in European universities, can scarcely read. Okay, so they loved the idea of sense and learning. Their clergy and the laity both studied not just the Bible, but the historians, orators, poets, and philosophers of Greece and Rome, to the point where they were familiar. And they had books in Latin and Greek, not to mention Hebrew, that their great-grandsons, even when educated in European universities, meaning as of that day, couldn't read, because they don't have the background knowledge necessary. They haven't studied classical Greek, classical Latin, or Hebrew to understand the things that they are actually studying in their original language. But sure as Shinola, the colonists in America did. And that's what John Adams is appealing to here. So they weren't allowed to be educated before, and now they're as educated as anybody possibly can be, to the point where somebody who doesn't even like them, an Archbishop King, says that, basically they need to be censured because they're the most educated, intelligent, and well-read people that he's ever encountered, including in his own church. So that concludes the first installment. Imagine you're reading this in the Boston Gazette, and that's where it stops. Monday, 19th August, 1765. So a few weeks later, you get the next episode. Thus accomplished were many of the first planters in these colonies. It may be thought polite and fashionable by many modern fine gentlemen perhaps to deride the characters of these persons as enthusiastical, superstitious, and republican, but such ridicule is founded in nothing but foppery and affectation, and is grossly injurious and false. In other words, it's slander. Religious to some degree of enthusiasm, it may be admitted they were, but this can be so he's talking again about the Puritans, who are very well read. They read multiple ancient languages. They study very widely, and also not just the Puritans themselves, the clergy, but the laity as well. And they were also thus accomplished. These very well-read, educated men were many of the first planters in these colonies. And today, so now that's like 1620 to 1660, here about 100, 120, 40 years later, it may be thought polite and fashionable by many modern fine gentlemen to deride the character of those persons as too enthusiastical, superstitious, and republican, basically too religious. But that's unfair. That's slander. He says, religious to some degree of enthusiasm, it might be admitted they were, but this can be no particular derogation from their character, because it was at the time almost the universal character not only of England, but of Christendom. Had this, however, been otherwise, their enthusiasm, considering the principles on which it was founded and the ends to which it was directed, far from being a reproach to them, was greatly to their honor. For I believe it will be found universally true that no great enterprise for the honor or happiness of mankind was ever achieved without a large mixture of that noble infirmity. Whatever imperfections may be justly ascribed to them, which, however, are as few as any mortals have discovered, their judgment in framing their policy was founded in wise, humane, and benevolent principles. It was founded in revelation and in reason, too. So if you've heard my lectures on the handshake between faith and reason being the magic sauce of the West, that's what John Adams is saying. These fine gentlemen who were quite religious and quite educated and quite well read and knew not just the Bible in its original languages, but also knew the Greeks and their philosophy, and the Romans and their tracts on particularly government in their original languages too, and they read widely and taught widely, and says that they were therefore establishing their governments, their of what both church and state, framing their policy was founded in wise, humane, and benevolent principles. It was founded in revelation and in reason too. It was consistent with the principles of the best and greatest and wisest legislators of antiquity. Tyranny in every form, shape, and appearance was their disdain and abhorrence. No fear of punishment, nor even of death itself in exquisite tortures, had been sufficient to conquer that steady, manly, pertinacious spirit with which they had opposed the tyrants of those days in church and state. They were very far from being enemies to monarchy, and they knew as well as any men the just regard and honor that is due to the character of a dispenser of the mysteries of the gospel of grace. So they did not hate the king, and they did not hate the clergy, but they saw clearly that popular powers must be placed as a guard, a control, a balance to the powers of the monarch and the priest in every government, or else it would soon become the man of sin, the whore of Babylon, the mystery of iniquity, a great and detestable system of fraud, violence, and usurpation. Their greatest concern seems to have been to establish a government of the church more consistent with the scriptures, and a government of the state more agreeable to the dignity of human nature than any they had seen in Europe, and to transmit such a government down to their posterity with the means of securing and preserving it forever. Damn, boys, isn't that something? This is what John Adams is writing about what the original colonists to the American continent were thinking and doing and how they were conducting themselves in the formative years that went on to become America after about a century and a half. He says to render the popular view, which is that they were, they're kind of overdoing it, to render the popular view in their new government as great and wise as their principles of theory, that is, as human nature and the Christian religion require it should be, they endeavored to remove from it as many of the feudal inequalities and dependencies as could be spared, consistently with the preservation of a mild, limited monarchy. And in this, they discovered the depth of their wisdom. I read that right. And in this, they discovered the depth of their wisdom and the warmth of their friendship to human nature. But the first place is due to religion. They saw clearly that of all the nonsense and delusion which had ever passed through the mind of man, none had ever been more extravagant than the notions of absolutions, indelible characters, uninterrupted successions, and the rest of those fantastical ideas derived from the canon law, which had thrown such a glare of mystery, sanctity, reverence, and right reverend eminence and holiness around the idea of a priest as no mortal could deserve, and as always must from the constitution of human nature be dangerous in society. That's another barn burner of a sentence, kind of a long one. So what that boils down to is, the priests of the Anglican and Catholic system are given, under the canon law, lots of power and honor and dignity and respect and whatever that they simply just don't deserve. As no mortal could deserve, by the way. Think about that. As no mortal could deserve. That is a all men are created equal statement in embryo like you have never conceived of. And he's saying that they looked at the structure of the European churches and religious hierarchies and were like, abso-freaking-lutely not. That of all the nonsense and delusion which had ever passed through the mind of man, none had ever been more extravagant than that which derived from the canon law, which he says always must from the constitution of human nature be dangerous in society. For this reason, they demolished the whole system of diocesan, is that how you say that? I think so. Episcopacy, and deriding as all reasonable and impartial men must do the ridiculous fancies of sanctified effluvia from episcopal fingers. They established sacerdotal ordination on the foundation of the Bible and common sense. Faith and reason shaking hands. This conduct at once imposed an obligation on the whole body of the clergy to industry, virtue, piety, and learning, and rendered that whole body infinitely more independent on the civil powers in all respects than they could be where they were formed into a scale of subordination from a pope down to priests and friars and confessors, necessarily and essentially a sordid, stupid, and wretched herd, or than they could be in any other country where an archbishop held the place of a universal bishop and the vicars and curates of that of the ignorant, dependent, miserable rabble aforesaid, and infinitely more sensible and learned than they could be in either. He's really not holding back on the canon law system. I don't think he's going to be a fan of a Christian nationalism once again. Certainly not integralism. This subject has been seen in the same light by many illustrious patriots who have lived in America since the days of our forefathers and who have adorned their memory for the same reason. And methinks there has not appeared in New England a stronger veneration for their memory, a more penetrating insight into the grounds and principles and spirit of their policy, nor a more earnest desire of perpetuating the blessings of it to posterity than that fine institution of the late Chief Justice Dudley, of a lecture against popery and on the validity of Presbyterian ordination. P.S. The chief in the lecture he's talking about was given by he's referring to, so the Chief Justice here is Paul Dudley, Superior Court of Massachusetts from 1745 till his death. But what we're actually talking about is that there was a lecture given, it turns out in 1750, in the institution set up by Dudley. And the lecture, the Dudleyan lecture, in 1750 was given by Jonathan Mayhew. Okay, it's the same one that we read from before. And so it is, let me see if the footnote here covers it. No. Okay, so anyway, I don't know what the lecture was about, except to say that it was against popery and on the validity of Presbyterian ordination, which is not the Jonathan Mayhew sermon that we read. Okay, so there's been no stronger veneration to the memory of the motivations of the colonists in setting up America the way that they did than a speech given by Jonathan Mayhew in a very august institution set up by the Chief Justice of the Superior Court of Massachusetts against popery and on the validity of Presbyterian ordination. Quick aside, in the 1780s, a lot of people ended up 1680s, so about 80 years before this, and certainly well known to the New Englanders. A whole bunch of people fled Europe. England, they went from England to the Netherlands, and then from the Netherlands to America to get away from a crackdown by the Stuart kings on Presbyterianism, which is this was called the killing times, actually, in England. And this persecution of Presbyterians was a massive reason for the peopling of America. And John Adams would certainly know about this, as would Jonathan Mayhew. And these lectures that they're giving, this essay that he's writing, would be consonant with understanding that when you give the church-state authority the power to crack down and persecute religious belief that they deem as to be wrong or harmful to the common good, that what you get is a kind of tyranny that's so evil that people are willing to throw everything into the air, to cross the ocean, risk their lives, risk their fortune, risk everything, separate from their families to establish a new way of being where that doesn't happen to them, and then to set up a new system of government for both church and state that has absolutely nothing to do with that set of evils. And he says this is the greatest vindication. But I just want to talk, or veneration, I should say, the greatest veneration of that, of those colonists coming over that peopled America. But I want to just focus on a little bit of language here from my side project here of encouraging you to have these book club things, which is a more penetrating insight into the grounds and principles and spirit of their policy, nor more. So what are we venerating? Their memory, a penetrating insight into the grounds and principles and spirit of their policy, and a desire to perpetuate the blessings of it to posterity. So this is what I'm saying is we aren't going to be able to pass down America to our posterity unless we understand what it was that made America. We should be looking to understand and venerate the memory of the people who created this country, which we're hearing a lot from in this essay. And we should be looking into the grounds and the principles and the spirit with which they came here. They established their policy. They executed that policy. They established their communities. They trial and errored, and they eventually established a new country with a constitution. If we wish to pass on to our posterity the blessings of America, then we need to understand and venerate the memory, the more penetrating insight into the grounds, principles, and spirit of the policy, and a more earnest desire to pass down those blessings by understanding them ourselves and kind of catching fire for the American spirit and founding. And so book clubs. Not to take away from the momentum, because we're still mid-giant paragraph here. This whole essay is almost one giant paragraph. This, he says, was certainly intended by that wise and excellent man, that's Jonathan Mayhew, as an eternal memento of the wisdom and goodness of the very principles that settled America. But I must again return to the feudal law. Okay, so again, here this excellent man is giving an eternal memento of the wisdom and goodness of the very principles that settled America. And what were they? A lecture against popery and on the validity of the Presbyterian ordination. But now he's going to turn back to feudal law. The adventurers so often mentioned, that's the people who came over at risk to colonize America, to get away from the tyranny of feudal and canon law. The adventurers so often mentioned had an utter contempt of all that dark ribaldry of heredity, indefeasible right, the Lord's anointed, and the divine miraculous original of government, with which the priesthood had enveloped the feudal monarch in clouds and mysteries, and from whence they had deduced the most mischievous of all doctrines, that of passive obedience and non-resistance. So that right there is directly a reference to the 1750 sermon of the same Jonathan Mayhew, which I read in a recent podcast, almost in full. So that was his discourse on the doctrine of passive obedience and non-resistance, which he was a discourse on Romans 13, which he declared to be absolutely absurd and inappropriate when the ruler is a tyrant, and that you should have instead a kind of doctrine of duty and obedience when the ruler is actually a just ruler. So very nuanced and strong take on Romans 13. And so here he's referencing, you can tell we just talked about it. He has Mayhew in mind, and here he brings it up again. The adventurers so often mentioned had an utter contempt of all that dark ribaldry of hereditary, indefeasible right, the Lord's anointed, and the divine miraculous original of government, that's the divine right of kings, with which the priesthood had enveloped the feudal monarch in clouds and mysteries, right? And from whence they had deduced the most mischievous of all doctrines, that of passive obedience and non-resistance. You can't resist a king who's ordained by God to be king, who can't be questioned, can you? Again, by the way, the woke right favors a guy called Joseph de Maistre, whose political theory was a reaction to the French Revolution, which is in the future from here. And his point is exactly that the sovereign has been ordained from God, so shut the F up and do what he says. He can't be wrong. And so America was founded on ignoring that Euro trash. We don't do Euro slop in America. We fled it and set up a different system on purpose. And we will simply not have passive obedience and non-resistance, which is the most mischievous of all doctrines, which is based on the idea that the priest can say that the king is there by the right, or by the writ and right of, he's there with the right by the writ and power of God, the ordination of God, and that surrounds the monarch in clouds and mysteries. Okay, so we're not going to be passively obedient and non-resistant to tyrants is the general theme. And I remind you that John Adams believed firmly, at least by 1765, that not only had he been aware of Mayhew's sermon to that point, but that virtually everybody in the colonies had read it. They knew, meaning our bold adventurers who colonized America, they knew that government was a plain, simple, intelligible thing, subject to common sense, guys, founded in nature and reason, and quite comprehensible by common sense. You don't need divine right of kings. You don't need de Maistre's theory of the divine sovereign, or of the Schmittian invention on that. Carl Schmitt later goes on in political theology to take de Maistre's idea of the sovereign and claim that the sovereign has the power to do whatever he wants because he's performing political miracles when he steps outside of the normative legal order. Nope. Americans are like, nope. They knew that government was a plain, simple, intelligible thing founded in nature and reason and quite comprehensible by common sense. You don't need weird theological theories justifying your leaders. They detested all the base services and servile dependencies of the feudal system. They knew that no such unworthy dependencies took place in the ancient seats of liberty, the republics of Greece and Rome, and they thought all such slavish subordinations were equally inconsistent with the constitution of human nature and that religious liberty with which Jesus had made them free. So there's some Greece, Rome, and Jesus saying, hell no, your feudal system is not real. So we are free. In all the great republics of antiquity, we were free, and Jesus made us free. Therefore, we are not your passive resistance, obedient, loyal, non-resisting subjects. This was certainly the opinion that they had formed, and they were far from being singular or extravagant in thinking so. Many celebrated modern writers in Europe have espoused the same sentiments. Lord Kames, a Scottish writer of great reputation, whose authority in this case ought to have the more weight, as his countrymen have not the most worthy ideas of liberty, speaking of the feudal law, says, quote, "A constitution so contradictory to all the principles which govern mankind can never be brought about, one should imagine, but by foreign conquest or native usurpations." Rousseau, speaking of the same system, calls it, quote, "that most iniquitous and absurd form of government by which the human nature was so shamefully degraded," end quote. It would be easy to multiply authorities, but it must be needless, because as the original of this form of government was among savages, as the spirit of its military and despotic, every writer who would allow the people to have any right to life or property or freedom more than the beasts of the field, and who was not hired or enlisted under arbitrary lawless power, has always been willing to admit the feudal system to be inconsistent with liberty and the rights of mankind. Period. And that's the end of his second installation. Okay, so he's saying we could go, quote, person after person after person saying that the feudal law is garbage and tyrannical, but it's needless because it's the organization that people used over effectively savages. The feudal law was organized to organize savages, not thinking people who exercise reason, not self-governing people who understand their circumstance. It's not befitting civilized man to be under feudal law, is what he's saying. In fact, it is inconsistent with the liberty and the rights of mankind. So he picks up September 30th, so like over a month later, with the next installation. September 30th, 1765, rapidly approaching the end of October implementation of the Stamp Act. To have holden their lands alloidally, that's a special word, I have to look that one up. It means, it's in the footnotes. This adverb derives from alloidal, which was defined in Webster's 1828 dictionary as pertaining to allodium, freehold, free of rent or service, held in dependence of a lord paramount opposed to feudal. In turn, allodium is defined as freehold estate, land in which the absolute property of the owner, real estate held in absolute independence without being subject to any rent, service, or acknowledgement to a superior. It is thus opposed to feud. In England, there is no alloidial land, all land being held of the king, but in the United States, most lands are alloidial. So he's using the fancy term. Of course, we all pay property taxes, so we can ask questions about if that's real anymore. To have holden their lands alloidially, so that means without a feudal lord, actually. They're not renting it or tenants on a lord's land. Or for every man to have been the sovereign lord and proprietor of the ground he occupied would have constituted a government too nearly like a commonwealth. They were contented, therefore, to hold their lands of their king as their sovereign lord, and to him they were willing to render homage, but no ments or subordinate lords, nor were they willing to submit to any of the baser services. Ments are like when you sublease your apartment, the person doing the subleasing is a ments. There's an owner, there's a renter. The renter who rents it to somebody else with a sublease is the ments in this case. Mesne, not ments. I'm reading it wrong. It's not a word I'm familiar with. M-E-S-N-E, mesne, I guess. Messen? I don't know how he would have pronounced it. Anyway, I digress. They were contented to hold their lands for the king as their sovereign lord, and to him they were willing to render homage, but to no mesne or subordinate lords, nor were they willing to submit to any of the baser services. And all this they were so strenuous that they have even transmitted to their posterity a very general contempt and detestation of the holdings by quitreants. What is a quitreant? That is a funny word. As they have also a hereditary order for liberty and a thirst for knowledge. So notice that these guys had words that we don't even know anymore because we're kind of dumb. Quitreant, a rent paid by a free man in lieu of the services required by feudal custom. So Yeah, okay. They were convinced by their knowledge of human nature, derived from history and their own experience, that nothing could preserve their posterity from the encroachments of the two systems of tyranny, in opposition to which, as has been observed already, they erected their government in church and state, but knowledge diffused generally through the whole body of the people. Okay, so they were willing to respect the king. They would not respect any lesser lords or middlemen. And they were not going to even have this idea that they're going to pay, quitterience instead of, they weren't going to pay to not own their own land. Again, we come back to this idea of property taxes. Just going to leave that hanging. But anyway, they were convinced, he says, by their knowledge of human nature derived from history and their own experiences, that there was only really one thing. Nothing could preserve for their posterity from the encroachments of the canon and feudal law, the two systems of tyranny. Nothing but knowledge diffused generally through the whole body of the people. That is, the only way we're going to stop tyranny, the colonists understood, was to know stuff. To be educated, to know who we are, to know where we came from, to know the grounds and principles of what we are doing, to understand what we paid in blood and treasure to get what we have, risk and sacrifice to get what we have, to understand the principles of natural law, to understand the principles of philosophy, to understand the republics of the Greeks and the Romans, to understand the stories of Israel and Jesus and what they mean biblically and religiously, to understand also their rights as Englishmen under the British Constitution. Their civil and religious principles, therefore, conspired to prompt them to use every measure and to take every precaution in their power to propagate and perpetuate knowledge. For this purpose, they laid very early the foundations of colleges and invested them with ample privileges and emoluments, and it is remarkable that they have left among their posterity so universal an affection and veneration for those seminaries and for liberal education, that the meanest of the people contribute cheerfully to the support and maintenance of them every year, and that nothing is more generally popular than projections for the honor, reputation, and advantages of those seats of learning. So Harvard University was set up in the Boston colony. This thing, Plymouth is 1620. By 1636, by the time the Boston colony is set up, I think it was 1632. 4 years later, 1636, you now have Harvard established as the first university. They set up other universities very quickly, and they started to teach people. And everybody loved these seminaries as they were, and for liberal education as well, not just seminaries, but seminaries and liberal educations, these universities, such that everybody contributed to them and everybody did whatever they could for the projections for their honor, reputation, and advantage of those seats of learning. Think about now, when I read this the first time a few days ago, I was like, my God, what the woke have done in stealing our colleges from us. Here we have John Adams explaining that the only way we can resist tyranny is by having the general diffusion of knowledge to the whole people. Therefore, the colonists, even before they were even thinking that they would be a separate country, took every measure that they could and every precaution they could manage to maintain and propagate and perpetuate knowledge, including setting up these universities right away, which had high renown. Early on, they were considered an indispensable part of what was going to make the colonies successful in what they attempted to do, which was to separate from the canon and feudal law of Europe and do something different in North America. And look at what the woke have wrought by ruining Harvard. Like, just think of what John Adams would have been sitting here thinking in 1765 in Boston, thinking of the pride and honor of Harvard approaching its surpassing its 100th year, coming up on its 130th year in service, and the honor and the reputation and the value and the service that it provides. Imagining this as this shining object that is defining the thing that has given the American colonies their unique character to resist tyranny, and then think about what the woke have stolen from us in our universities. I sat here. I had to set this aside for like 20 minutes and just stare. I think I made a tweet about something about like the Grievance Studies affair or something in the meantime. Imagine being John Adams in 1765, writing these words, thinking of Harvard University and what it means to a free America. And then imagine him encountering Harvard 2026. It's almost incomprehensible. It's almost incomprehensible. But let's go back to his text. But the wisdom and benevolence of our fathers rested not here. They made an early provision by law that so they didn't stop with the universities, with Harvard. They made an early provision by law that every town consisting of so many families should always be furnished with a grammar school. They made it a crime for such a town to be destitute of a grammar schoolmaster for a few months, and subjected it to a heavy penalty, so that the education of all ranks of people was made the care and expense of the public in a manner that I believe has been unknown to any other people, ancient or modern. So then pause and think about what the woke and the teachers' unions have done to our schools, and the purposes that the colonists had in making sure that every child learned to read and learned grammar, became generally educated, and that the purpose was to resist the tyrannies of the canon and feudal law. And then so imagine him seeing, maybe it's in the 80s or 90s or something, not that they were great, but it's just seeing the American education system operating, and then to realize that it was going to be stolen and transformed into this monstrosity that undermines the case for liberty itself, like it's a religious duty. And that the university, I'm telling you, I had to just stop after I read this paragraph and just imagine the shock to his mind that the engines he believed were the guarantors of resisting tyranny of king and priest have been completely gutted, undermined, and inverted and reversed by the monstrosities of the woke. Just so hard to contemplate. But let's go back to the text. Let's not linger. The consequences of these establishments, we're not going to get away from it though, right? The consequences of these establishments we see and feel every day. A native of America who cannot read and write is as rare in appearance as a Jacobite or a Roman Catholic. That is, as rare as a comet or an earthquake. Okay, so much for that, right? It has been observed that we are, all of us, lawyers, divines, politicians, and philosophers, and I have good authorities to say that all candid foreigners who have passed through this country and conversed freely with all sorts of people here will allow that they have never seen so much knowledge and civility among the common people in any part of the world. That, to John Adams, is what set Americans apart from everybody else and made them a people fit to resist tyranny and live without it. It is true there has been many among us party for some years, consisting chiefly not of the descendants of the first settlers of this country, but of high churchmen and high statesmen imported since, who affect to censure this provision for the education of our youth as a needless expense, and an imposition upon the rich in favor of the poor, and as an institution productive of idleness and vain speculation among the people, whose time and attention, it is said, ought to be devoted to labor and not to public affairs, or to examination into the conduct of their superiors. That last one's real important, right? And certain officers of the crown. So what he's saying is, but now we've had these other people come in among us in the colonies, priests in some cases, high churchmen and high statesmen have come in and said, no, you don't need that education stuff because it'll waste time. It misuses money. It wastes the rich's money who are primarily funding it. It causes vain and idle speculation, conspiracy theories and stuff. But what people should be doing is working. They shouldn't be paying attention to public affairs, and they seriously really shouldn't be looking into the conduct of their corrupt superiors. And certain officers of the crown, he goes on, and certain other missionaries of ignorance, foppery, servility, and slavery have been most inclined to countenance and increase the same party. So the British Crown seems to want these people to come in and say, no, Americans don't need to know what the hell's going on, and they don't need to be able to look into the corruptions above them in particular. That's one of the reasons why he's arguing that we need an intelligent, educated population so that they can examine the doings of their tyrants and criticize them and escape and resist them. And he says there are certain officers of the crown that are trying to do the same thing. Be it remembered, however, that liberty must at all hazards be supported. At what? At which hazards? Some of them, until, whatever, some woke guy thinks the wrong thing or Muslims move in. Be it remembered, however, that liberty must at all hazards be supported. We have a right to it derived from our Maker, capital M. Okay, so take that in, right? Just take that in. Liberty must be supported at any risk because we have a right to it, which is derived from God. But if we had not, if you can't reason that out, he's going to go on and give another explanation. But if we had not, our fathers have earned and bought it for us at the expense of their ease, their estates, their pleasure, and their blood. So why don't you show some gratitude for the people who suffered, risked, and died and sacrificed for you to have your freedom? And liberty, he says, cannot be preserved without a general knowledge among the people who have a right from the frame of their nature to knowledge, as their great Creator, who does nothing in vain, has given them understandings and a desire to know. But besides this, they have a right, an indisputable, unalienable, indefeasible, divine right to that most dreaded and envied kind of knowledge. I mean, knowledge of the characters and conducts of their rulers. Now, that's a bold statement, but the next sentence is even bolder to have written in 1765. Rulers are no more than attorneys, agents, and trustees for the people. And if the cause, the interest, and trust is insidiously betrayed or wantonly trifled away, the people have a right to revoke the authority that they themselves have deputed and to constitute abler and better agents, attorneys, and trustees. The king isn't a king, he's an attorney, an agent, or a trustee, and if he works for the people, and if he sucks, we can kick him out. That's right at that line of treason. And the preservation of the means of knowledge among the lowest ranks is of more importance to the public than all the property of all the rich men in the country. So, I'm going to read that one again too. The preservation of the means of knowledge among the lowest ranks, not among the elites, not among the new elites of the dark enlightenment woke right. The preservation of the means of knowledge among the lowest ranks is of more importance to the public than all the property of all the rich men in the country. It is even of more consequence to the rich themselves and to their posterity. The only question is whether it is a public emolument, and if it is, the rich ought undoubtedly to contribute in the same proportion as to all other public burdens, that is, in proportion to their wealth, which is secured by public expenses. But none of the means of information are more sacred or have been cherished with more tenderness and care by the settlers of America than the press. Care has been taken that the art of printing should be encouraged and that it should be easy and cheap and safe for any person to communicate his thoughts to the public. And remember, this is a rejection of the Stamp Act, which would give the stamping authority the power to decide what gets a stamp and thus what can be printed. And you, messieurs printers, whatever the tyrants of the earth may say of your paper, have done important service to your country by your readiness and freedom in publishing the speculations of the curious, The stale, impudent insinuations of slander and sedition with which the gormandizers of power have endeavored to discredit your paper are so much more to your honor, for the jaws of power are always opened to devour, and her arm is always stretched out, if possible, to destroy the freedom of thinking, speaking, and writing. So here he honors the paper for publishing things freely because of that really colorful way of saying that people want you to be censored all the time. And if the public interest, liberty, and happiness have been in danger from the ambition or avarice of any great man, whatever may be his politeness, address, learning, ingenuity, and in other respects integrity and humanity, you, again that's the printers, have done yourselves honor and your country service by publishing and pointing out that avarice and ambition. So exposing the bad guy is really a noble point of the press, which requires a free press, right? These vices are so much more the dangerous and pernicious for the virtues with which they may be accompanied in the same character, and with so much the more watchful jealousy to be guarded against. Quote, curse on such virtues, they've undone our country. So this is quoting Joseph Addison, Cato, Act 4, Scene 4, apparently. Be not intimidated, therefore, still talking to the publishers, be not intimidated, therefore, by any terrors from publishing with the utmost freedom whatever can be warranted by the laws of your country, nor suffer yourselves to be wheedled out of your liberty by any pretenses of politeness, delicacy, or decency. These, as they are often used, are but three different names for hypocrisy, chicanery, and cowardice. Much less, I presume, will you be discouraged by any pretenses that malignants on this side of the water will represent for your paper as factious and seditious, or the great on the other side of the water will take offense at them. So he's trying to encourage the paper to keep publishing stuff that the powers that be don't want. He's strongly defending freedom of speech and press here, by the way. Again, if you want to know where the Bill of Rights came from, all you have to do is read some of the trials and tribulations of the colonists from, the late 1740s, probably, or thereabouts, up until they decided that they needed a Bill of Rights in the 1780s, or 1790, thereabout, 1789, I think. This dread of representation has for a long time in this province effects very similar to what the physicians call a hydropho, or dread of water, hydrophobia. It has made us delirious, and we have rushed headlong into the water till we are almost drowned out of simple or frenzical fear of it. Believe me, the character of this country has suffered more in Britain by the pusillanimity with which we have borne many insults and indignities from the creatures of power at home and the creatures of those creatures here than it ever did or ever will by the freedom and spirit that has been or will be discovered in writing or action. So cowardice and weakness are more dangerous than speech. Believe me, my countrymen, they have imbibed an opinion on the other side of the water that we are an ignorant, a timid, and a stupid people. Nay, their tools on this side have often the impudence to dispute your bravery. But I hope in God the time is near at hand when they will be fully convinced of your understanding, integrity, and courage. But can anything be more ridiculous, were it not too provoking to be laughed at, than to pretend that offense should be taken at home for writings here? Home, by the way, means in Britain. Pray let them look at home. Is not the human understanding exhausted there? Are not reason, imagination, wit, passion, senses, and all tortured to find out satire and invective against the characters of the vile and futile fellows who sometimes get into places of power? The most exceptionable paper that I ever saw here is perfect prudence and modesty compared to the multitudes of their applauded writings. Yet the high regard they have for freedom of the press indulges all. I must and will repeat it. Your paper deserves the patronage of every friend to his country, and whether the defamers of it are arrayed in robes of scarlet or sable, whether they lurk and skulk, that would be state and church, by the way, whether they lurk and skulk in an insurance office, whether they assume the venerable character of a priest, the sly one of a scrivener, or the dirty, infamous, abandoned one of an informer, they are all creatures and tools of the lust of domination. The true source of our sufferings has been our timidity. I'm willing to bet, although I don't know the history here, that between number 2 and number 3, that the paper got threatened a lot and accused and all these things for printing these articles. And so John Adams was reassuring the printers of the paper, the Boston Gazette, and this whole second half of this third piece, that freedom of speech and press is much more valuable and important. And besides, these people are stupid hypocrites and don't listen to them and they don't know what they're talking about. Finally, Monday, 21st October, 1765, the fourth piece comes out. This is just before the Stamp Act is meant to take effect a week and a half later. And it starts with a very ominous sentence. Now, I'll go back. The previous essay ended with the true source of our sufferings has been our timidity. And he just had this very impassioned defense of freedom of speech, freedom of knowing and disseminating knowledge. And he ends that with the true source of our sufferings has been our timidity. And reflect on that for our time, right? How many times have we said that we've let the woke take over because we were afraid to be called a racist? The true source of our sufferings has been our timidity. But of course, we are not called to rash action. You heard that at the end of Mayhew's sermon, if you listened to that episode. But he goes on in this fourth episode with an incredible first sentence. We have been afraid to think. We have been afraid to think. The true source of our sufferings has been our timidity. We have been afraid to think. So he goes from 3 to 4, leaves off and starts. The true source of our sufferings has been our timidity. We have been afraid to think. We have felt a reluctance to examining into the grounds of our privileges and the extent in which we have an indisputable right to demand them against all the power and authority on earth. And many who have not scrupled to examine for themselves have yet, for certain prudent reasons, been cautious and diffident of declaring the result of their inquiries. So, that's antique language. Let's modernize it a little bit. All right, the source of our suffering has been our cowardice, our timidity. We've been afraid to think. We've been reluctant to even look into why we have the rights and privileges that we do. And we've been afraid even to look into why we have, and to the extent to which we have an indisputable right to demand them against all the power and authority on earth. And many who have not scrupled to examine for themselves have yet, for certain prudent reasons, been cautious and diffident of declaring the result of their inquiries. So, some people have actually looked into this, but they're too scared to say so. They're too scared to say that, no, this is against the Constitution. We have a right. Doesn't this paragraph talk to us now? 1765, pre-revolutionary period. The source of our sufferings has been our timidity. We have been afraid to think. We felt a reluctance to examining into the grounds of our privilege and the extent in which we have an indisputable right to demand them against all the power and authority on earth. And many who have not scrupled to examine for themselves have yet, for certain prudent reasons, maybe it's their job, been cautious and diffident of declaring the result of their inquiries. The cause of this timidity is perhaps hereditary, and to be traced back in history as far as the cruel treatment of the first settlers of this country received before their embarkation for America from the government at home. So maybe we got it beaten into us before we came over. Everybody knows, he says, how dangerous it was to speak or write in favor of anything in those days, but the triumphant system of religion and politics. So you weren't going to say anything except to praise the tyranny of the church-state system, the Christian nationalism of the Anglican Church and British Crown specifically, but mirrored in country after country throughout Europe. And if you might guess, he would have a lot of choice things to say about the Catholic monarchy in France. And our fathers, he says, were particularly the objects of the persecutions and prescriptions of the time. It is not unlikely, therefore, that although they were inflexibly steady in refusing their positive assent to anything against their principles, they might have contracted habits of reserve and a cautious diffidence of asserting their opinions publicly. These habits they probably brought with them to America or have transmitted down to us. Or we may possibly account for this appearance by the great affection and veneration Americans have always entertained for the country from whence they sprang, or by the quiet temper for which they have been remarkable, no country having been less disposed to discontent than this, or by a sense they have that it is their duty to acquiesce under the administration of government, even when in many smaller matters grievous to them, and until the essentials of the great compact are destroyed and invaded. So he's like, okay, so maybe we inherited it from our forefathers who learned to keep their mouths shut by being beaten and persecuted. They stuck to their principles and left, but they didn't speak out. They didn't speak back. Or perhaps we got it in a different way. Maybe it's that we actually love Britain. And notice, by the way, the separation that he's already taught. 1765, we're 11 years from the Declaration. The great affection and veneration Americans have always entertained for the country from whence they sprang. There's already this conceptual separation between the Americans and the British there, even though they are British. Or maybe it's the quiet temper for which we have been remarkable, having suffered lots of iniquities, but nothing big enough to really bring it to a point. Doesn't that speak to us about the woke? Yeah, we've suffered a lot of violations of, common sense and decency and goodness and fairness, but we don't need to throw the whole thing. We don't need to lose it over it, right? It's affirmative action's totally actually wrong, but they had a tough time in the past. So maybe it's just that, we have as he says it here, a quiet temper for which we have been remarkable. No country, he says, having been less disposed to discontent than this, or by a sense, that's another option, or by a sense that they have that it is their duty to acquiesce under the administration of government. So you're supposed to just, the government said so just go with it, like Canada. Even when in many smaller matters grievous to them, and until the essentials of the great compact are destroyed or invaded. These particular causes might operate upon them, but without these, we all know that human nature itself, from indolence, modesty, humanity, or fear, has always too much reluctance to a manly assertion of its rights. Hence, perhaps, it has happened that 9/10 of the species are groaning and gasping in misery and servitude. Now, if you remember the Mayhew, he says the same thing, that most of the population of the world is groaning but not murmuring under servitude. So John Adams is echoing that here. But whatever the cause has been, so he's like, we've been timid. Why have we been timid? Well, here's a lot of possible reasons. But whatever the cause has been, doesn't matter. Whatever the cause has been, the fact is certain. We have been excessively cautious of giving offense by complaining of grievances. And it is as certain that American governors and their friends and all the crown officers have availed themselves of this disposition of the people. So we don't complain, so they take advantage of us not complaining. They have prevailed on us to consent to many things which were grossly injurious to us, and to surrender many others with voluntary tameness to which we had the clearest right. Have we not been treated formerly with abominable insolence by officers of the Navy? In this case, he's talking about something that were called press gangs. The press gangs would come from the Royal Navy into cities like Boston. They needed to fill a ship with people that they could, sail to war with, and they would press 40 or 50 young people that they would just find and say, you're in the Navy now, and would push them onto the boat. And if they didn't, they could be hanged. And that's what he's talking about here. Have we not been treated formerly with abominable insolence by officers of the Navy? I mean, no insinuation against any gentleman now on this station, having heard no complaint of any one of them to his dishonor. Have not some generals from England treated us like servants, nay, more like slaves than like Britons? Have we not been under the most ignominious contribution, the most abject submission, the most supercilious insults of some custom house officers? Have we not been trifled with, browbeaten, and trampled on by former governors in a manner which no king of England since James II has dared to indulge toward his subjects? Have we not raised up one family, in them placed in unlimited confidence, and then been soothed and flattered and intimidated by their influence into a great part of this infamous tameness and submission? Quote, "These are serious and alarming questions, and they deserve a dispassionate consideration." It does not say who he's quoting there. This disposition, meaning our tameness, our timidness, our fear to think and to assert the results of our inquiry when we do dare to look, this disposition has been the great wheel and the mainspring in the American machine of court politics. We have been told that, quote, "the word rights is an offensive expression." Quote, "that the king, his ministry, and parliament will not endure to hear Americans talk of their rights." Quote, "that Britain is the mother and we the children, that a filial duty and submission is due from us to her." And that, quote, "we ought to doubt our own judgment and presume that she is right even when she seems to shake the foundations of government." That, quote, "Britain is immensely rich and great and powerful, has fleets and armies at her command which have been the dread and terror of the universe, and that she will force her judgment into execution right or wrong." End quote. "But let me entreat you, sir," now he's speaking to these bold British voices, by the way, that's sir, "but let me entreat you, sir, to pause. Do you consider yourself as a missionary of loyalty or of rebellion? Are you not representing your king, his ministry and parliament as tyrants, imperious, unrelenting tyrants by such reasoning as this? Is this not representing your most gracious sovereign as endeavoring to destroy the foundations of his own throne? Are you not representing every member of Parliament as renouncing the transactions at Runningmead, the meadow near Windsor where Magna Carta was signed, and as repealing in effect the Bill of Rights when the Lords and Commons asserted and vindicated the rights of the people and their own rights and insisted on the king's assent to that assertion and vindication? Do you not represent them as forgetting that the Prince of Orange was created King William by the people on purpose that their rights might be eternal and inviolable? Is there not something extremely fallacious in the commonplace images of mother country and children colonies? Are we the children of Great Britain any more than the cities of London, Exeter, and Bath? Are we not brethren and fellow subjects with those in Britain, only under a somewhat different method of legislation and a totally different method of taxation? But admitting we are children, have not children a right to complain when their parents are attempting to break their limbs, to administer poison, or to sell them to enemies for slaves? Let me entreat you to consider, will the mother be pleased when you represent her as deaf to the cries of her children, when you compare her to the infamous miscreant who lately stood on the gallows for starving her child, when you resemble her to Lady Macbeth in Shakespeare? I cannot think of it without horror." Then quoting the bard, he says, "Who had given suck and knew how tender 'twas to love the babe that milked her, but yet who could, even while 'twas smiling in her face, have plucked her nipple from the boneless gums and dashed the brains out." Let us banish, actually, let me summarize what just happened there. He's been talking to all these good sirs of England who have spoken down to the Americans and said basically that you are unruly children, we will force you, we will rule you, you can't do anything other than what we say. And he says, do you not actually embarrass yourself here? Are you not undercutting the actual duties of your king and parliament? Are you not refusing your duties as actual human beings to one another and then comparing them to the monstrosities here depicted in Macbeth. Let us banish forever from our minds, my countrymen, all such unworthy ideas of the king, his ministry, and parliament. Think about that right there, 1765. Let us banish forever from our minds, my countrymen, all such unworthy ideas of the king, his ministry, and the parliament. So we're not going to think of, the Britons are portraying the king, the ministers, and the parliament in this horrible way, but let's not think of them like they are. Let us not suppose that they are all become luxurious, effeminate, and unreasonable on the other side of the water, as many designing persons would insinuate. Let us presume what is in fact true, that the spirit of liberty is as ardent as ever among the body of the nation, though a few individuals may be corrupted. So he's like, let's not blame them all. Let's throw some insults in the form of saying that they're not all like that it's a corruption. It's not the trend. 1765, keep it cool. We can't go all the way to treason here. Let us take for granted, again speaking to the Americans, that this same great spirit which once gave, this is brilliant by the way, let us take it for granted that the same great spirit which once gave Caesar so warm a reception, which denounced hostilities against John till Magna Carta was signed, which severed the head of Charles I from his body and drove James II from his kingdom, the same great spirit, may heaven preserve it till the earth shall be no more, which first seated the great grandfather of his present and most gracious majesty on the throne of Britain, let us take it for granted that it is still alive and active and warm in England, and that the same spirit in America, instead of provoking the inhabitants of that country, will endear us to them forever and secure their goodwill. So here he's begging Britain to live up to who they're supposed to be and saying the Americans are going to treat you as though you are who you're supposed to be, and we're not going to think otherwise of you, which is a very interesting and subtle way of saying they're not doing it. But then what does he tuck in there? And this is why it's brilliant. So he tucks in a few examples of people that got chased out of their kingdoms or lost their heads or stabbed, right? Liberty is the great spirit. Let's assume it's still there. P.S. This is a little bit of a warning, right? Let us assume that the great spirit of liberty, which once gave Caesar so warm a reception, right, Brutus? Which denounced hostilities against John till Magna Carta was signed, which severed the head of Charles I from his body and drove James II from his kingdom. Let's assume that liberty is still there. Because if it's not, here's 4 examples of what we're going to do. That's so freaking baller to write. That's so close to treason in 1765. So baller that he wrote it that way. This is genius. This spirit, it's liberty, of course. This spirit, however, without knowledge, would be little better than a brutal rage. Let us tenderly and kindly cherish, therefore, the means of knowledge. Let us dare to read, think, speak, and write. Let every order and degree among the people rouse their attention and animate their resolution. Let them all become attentive to the grounds and principles of government, ecclesiastical and civil. Let us study the law of nature, search into the spirit of the British Constitution, read the histories of the ancient ages, contemplate the great examples of Greece and Rome, set before us the conduct of our own British ancestors who have defended for us the inherent rights of mankind against foreign and domestic tyrants and usurpers, against arbitrary kings and cruel priests, in short, against the gates of earth and hell. Let us read and recollect and impress upon our souls the views and ends of our own more immediate forefathers, in exchanging their native country for a dreary, inhospitable wilderness. Let us examine into the nature of that power and the cruelty of that oppression which drove them from their homes. Let's be honest about what's going on here, right? Recollect their amazing fortitude, their bitter sufferings, the hunger, the nakedness, the cold, which they patiently endured, the severe labors of clearing their grounds, building their houses, raising their provisions amongst dangers from wild beasts and savage men, before they had time or money or materials for commerce. recollect the civil and religious principles and hopes and expectations which constantly supported and carried them through all hardships with patience and resignation. Let us recollect it was liberty, the hope of liberty for themselves and us and ours, which conquered all discouragements, dangers, and trials. In such researches as these, let us all in our several departments cheerfully engage, but especially the proper patrons and supporters of law, learning, and religion. Let the pulpits resound with, what is the Christian national? Remember, this guy's the Christian nationalist, right? The Constitution was written for moral and religious people and wholly inadequate to any other. Therefore, we need some fucknut Christian nationalism. Let the pulpit resound with the doctrines and sentiments of religious liberty. Let us hear the danger of thraldom to our consciences from ignorance, extreme poverty, and dependence, in short, from civil and political slavery. Let us see delineated before us the true map of man. Let us hear the dignity of his nature and the noble rank he holds among the works of God. That consenting to slavery is a sacrilegious breach of trust, as offensive in the sight of God as it is derogatory from our own honor or interest or happiness, and that God Almighty has promulgated from heaven liberty, peace, and goodwill to man. Let the bar, that's the legal bar, let the bar proclaim the laws, the rights, the generous plan of power delivered down from remote antiquity, inform the world of the mighty struggles and numberless sacrifices made by our ancestors in defense of freedom. Let it be known that British liberties are not the grants of princes or parliaments, but original rights, conditions of original contracts coequal with prerogative and coeval with government, that many of our rights are inherent and essential, agreed on as maxims and established as preliminaries even before a parliament existed. Let them search for the foundations of British laws and government in the frame of human nature and in the constitution of the intellectual and moral world. Let us see that truth, liberty, justice, and benevolence are its everlasting basis, and if these could be removed, the superstructure is overthrown, of course. Let the colleges join their harmony in the same delightful concert. That's a sad trombone for us today. Let every declamation turn upon the beauty of liberty and virtue, and the deformity, turpitude, and malignity of slavery and vice. Let the public disputations become researches into the grounds and natures and ends of government. Disputations here would mean debates. Let the public debates become researches into the grounds and nature and ends of government and the means of preserving the good and demolishing the evil. Let the dialogues and all the exercises become the instruments of impressing on the tender mind and of spreading and distributing far and wide the ideas of right and sensations of freedom. In a word, let every sluice of knowledge be opened and set a-flowing. The encroachments upon liberty in the reigns of the first James and the first Charles, by the turning the general attention of learned men to government, are said to have produced the greatest number of consummate statesmen which has ever been seen in any age or any nation. So we have these tyrants. They produced great thinkers on politics. The Brookes, the Hampdens, Vanes, Seldens, Miltons, Needhams, Harringtons, Nevilles, Sidneys, Locks are all said to have owed their eminence in political knowledge to the tyrannies of those reigns. The prospect now before us in America ought, in the same manner, to engage the attention of every man of learning to matters of power and of right, that we may be neither led nor driven blindfolded to irretrievable destruction. So we should study the tyrants to know what we don't want to do. That's big far cry from studying the tyrants to find out what to do. I'm thinking like the DSA studying Mao or Lenin or Stalin or any of the communists or Marx or the woke right looking into the fascists. Franco as a semi-fascist, Mussolini and Hitler as genuine fascists, in fact a National Socialist, and so on and so forth. Look to the tyrants to learn how to be free, not how to copy them. The prospect now before us in America ought in the same manner to engage the attention of every man of learning. That's what he says, to matters of power and of right, that we may be neither led nor driven blindfolded to irretrievable destruction. Nothing less than this seems to have been meditated for us by somebody or another in Great Britain. There seems to be a direct and formal design on foot to enslave all America. There's a conspiracy, there's an op to put us all down, to enslave all America. Words that resonate today. This, however, must be done by degrees. The first step that is intended seems to be an entire subversion of the whole system of our fathers by the introduction of the canon and feudal law in America. R.I.P. Christian nationalism. The canon and feudal systems, though greatly mutilated in England, are not yet destroyed. Like the temples and palaces in which the great contrivers of them once worshipped and inhabited, they exist in ruins, and much of the domineering spirit of them still remains. The designs and labors of a certain society to introduce the former of them into America have been well exposed to the public by a writer of great abilities. This is specifically talking about Jonathan Mayhew again. And his previous Dudleyan lecture, so I'll do that again. The designs and labors of a certain society, the popery, to introduce the former of them, the canon law, have been well exposed to the public by a writer of great abilities, Jonathan Mayhew, and the further attempts to the same purpose that may be made by that society or by the ministry or parliament, I leave to the conjectures of the thoughtful. But it seems very manifest from the Stamp Act itself. He finally mentions it. It's literally a few sentences from the end. He finally mentions the point of the whole essay series, which is the Stamp Act. Where did I leave off? But it seems very manifest from the Stamp Act itself that a design is formed to strip us in a great measure of the means of knowledge by loading the press, the colleges, and even an almanac and a newspaper with the restraints and duties, and to introduce the inequalities and dependencies of the feudal system by taking from the poorer sort of people all their little subsistence and conferring it on a set of stamp officers, distributors, and their deputies. We could actually make a really cool parallel here with the student loans problem and the garbage that's in the colleges if we tried. But, he says, I must proceed no further at present. The sequel, whenever I shall find health and leisure to pursue it, he didn't have health problems and he never found the leisure from what I understand, will be a disquisition of the policy of the Stamp Act. The reason he never pursued it is because the Stamp Act was dead on arrival. There was so much disquiet, including back in August when he first started writing this. There was so much rioting. There were so many not civil ways of approaching the problem that the Stamp Act never actually got implemented in America. So he never had to pursue it further. In the meantime, however, he says, let me add, these are not the vapors of a melancholy mind, nor the effusions of envy, disappointed ambition, nor of a spirit of opposition to government, but the emanations of a heart that burns for its country's welfare. I like to wonder if he meant Britain, yes, or America, maybe. No one of any feeling born and educated in this once happy country can consider the numerous distresses, the gross indignities, the barbarous ignorance, the haughty usurpations that we have reason to fear are mediating for ourselves, our children, our neighbors, in short, for all our countrymen and all their posterity, without the utmost agonies of heart and many tears. So that's another very resonant thing, right? He's saying, look, I don't hate my country. I don't hate Britain. I'm here burning for the country's welfare, but we've suffered, and this is again, think of all of COVID, all of woke. He says, no one of any feeling born and educated in this once happy country can consider the numerous distresses, the gross indignities, the barbarous ignorance, the haughty usurpations, Dr. Fauci, that we have reason to fear are meditating for ourselves, our children, our neighbors, in short, for all of our countrymen and their posterity, without the utmost agonies of heart and many tears. We're terrified. We're stressed. We're afraid that this whole thing is about to come undone. And that's what motivated John Adams to write this absolute condemnation of the fusion of church and state in resistance to the Stamp Act, and thus to write one of the documents that was one of the primary burning lights that gave rise to the American Revolution and thus the American experiment. And it has been a genuine honor and pleasure to read. I have enjoyed this like very few things I've read through. I have enjoyed sharing this with you so much. I want to encourage you to find a bit of that fire, to pick up a piece of that spark, and to go read these things. Read this for yourself. Read the Federalist Papers are a little more technical in what they're arguing, but read these debates. Read these speeches and sermons that were given that are considered foundational. Go find, there's not one made. Maybe we can work on making some. Find or make or design a curriculum. I'm using these two books that I mentioned, Eric Metaxas's Revolution, which I'm loving, Tim Sandifer's Proclaiming Liberty, which I don't know as well yet. I've read a little bit. As guides to pick these documents up and to want to share them with you. You can do the same thing. You can buy those same books and you can see which essays, sermons, speeches, etc. are referenced. There are some that don't exist because they weren't written down, but there are so many of these letters, Washington's farewell address, etc., that you can go find and read and share and do in groups and make podcasts out of. There's so much reason to take that little spark, that little fire, and to spread it all over this great country, and to do it with your kids, and to do it regularly, and to do it enthusiastically, and to understand our forefathers and what they sacrificed to give us this country, but more importantly, to understand why they were sacrificing in the first place, the history, the principles, the legalities, the whole thing, our rights, where they come from, the natural philosophy that it's based on, the common sense, Scottish common sense, realism, Thomas Reid and so on, that inspired that line of thinking we heard directly appealed to, the Bible. These things are all accessible at your fingertips, whether you're young or old. The English is somewhat more difficult than the average because they were a very educated people, not just because of the style of the time, but pick up the flame and just spread it everywhere and teach everybody you can about what an amazing country this was and why it is so, what it was based on, what these guys that were building it the way they built it were thinking and experiencing and sacrificing and facing and risking, and why they were doing it. And man, can we save this country.